Hi and welcome back to the Journey to Nebula Sew Along. I'm Julie Herman of Jaybird Quilts and I'll be your guide on this journey. This week we are going to work on piecing diamonds for the Seaside Table Runner that we cut last week. Let's get started. First step is laying out your pieces. What I've done here is laid out the first 5 rows, and there were some questions on arrangement within the pattern. It just repeats. So if you consider this fabric 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you'll then go again 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you'll notice they always go in the same order. Just start with a different one at the top so that you have more of a random look. That being said, you can go totally scrappy. I've made these both ways. It looks good no matter how you do it. So you want to get everything laid out, and if you're going to do the table runner, lay it out as the pattern says. If you're going to do the placemats, you're going to do half as many rows. When I begin piecing, I work and I chain piece. I'll start with the first 2 from each row, and I'll chain piece those together, and then I'll bring them back to my design wall and I'll add the 3rd piece, then the 4th, so forth and so on. But what I've discovered when I teach the class, I'll show you another method, is that some people don't like to take that many pieces off their design wall at one time, and they prefer to work in pairs by rows. So sew these 2 together, then these 2, then these 2, you'll be left with 1, and then sew those together to complete that row and do 1 row at a time. Whichever way makes the most sense to you is how you should do it. I just wanted to give you some options. Now, when you get to your machine, you will discover that half of our sides are straight of grain and half are bias. Don't let that scare you. It's not as intimidating as it may seem. What you'll find is half of your rows, so this first row you're sewing straight seams, all straight seams together, and then your next row, these are all bias. We're only working with a 2-inch piece here, so you shouldn't have too much trouble, but be aware that it's bias. I personally don't starch. There were some questions about that as well. If you like to starch, that's totally fine. I find that it's not necessary. It's an extra added step. So let's hop on over to the sewing machine. Now we are over at the sewing machine, and we're going to get started on piecing our diamonds for our rows. And these are the first 2 pieces for row 1 and then row 2, so forth and so on. I am sewing on a Husqvarna Viking Ruby, and what I do for my 1/4 inch is I use a 1/4 inch foot with a guide, and I move my needle over to 1.8. You know your machine best to know what's going to give you that perfect scant, which is like 1 thread over 1/4 inch. So you set up your machine how it works best for you. That's not my area of expertise in knowing each machine. And then I use R-Fill 50 weight for my piecing, and my favorite color is 2600. It's this great medium gray that just kind of blends in perfectly to everything. So let's get started. The first 2 pieces in row 1, we're going to be sewing a straight of grain side to a straight of grain side. So since we cut those notches off last week, makes our alignment super, super easy. Let's get that lined up so you can see. Right there and right there. Now, you could pin this. I generally don't, but I'm gonna show you, if you are interested in pinning, how I suggest you pin it, which is just put a little one here, way far out of the seam allowance so you don't accidentally sew over a pin, because that's never good, and another one right there. So we're gonna take this in the machine and sew our 1/4 inch. And then our next 2 pieces, instead of straight of grain, we have bias. And this is not something to worry about. It's just a small section. If you actively stretch it, yes, it will move in a way that straight of grain doesn't. But if you just handle it carefully, not gonna have any problems. So again, we're gonna flip it over and use those notches that we cut off to help us perfectly align it. And as I mentioned, I generally don't pin, so I'm gonna show you without pinning, but if you wanna pin, you can pin like I did on the first one. So that one, and then the next one, back to row 3, we're working with straight of grain again, so we're gonna keep going back and forth. Every other row is going to be bias or straight of grain, and it's not a problem. It's going to still yield a perfectly flat table runner in the end. So after I piece all of the first two of every row, I'm going to take them over and I'm going to press the seams open and then add the third piece. So I will see you over at pressing. Now that we've begun sewing our pairs together, we have two options. We can head to the ironing board and plug in our iron, or we can use our seam roller. This was something I mentioned in the tools video. So my Violet Craft seam roller is one of my favorite tools because it saves me from turning the iron off and on and hopping over there a lot. No problem with ironing these, but I find this saves me time. So I press all of my seams open. I find that everything aligns best that way. If you've never done it open before, I suggest trying. And if you're not comfortable, you don't have to continue that way, but you never know if you haven't tried before. So some people set the seams. I don't set the seams. I don't find that I need to. If you find that you want to, go ahead, plug your iron in, set your seams. So I just open my seam up with my fingers, and then the magic of the seam roller, just back and forth, and it's just like I pressed it over with the iron, but I didn't even have to turn it on. So I will do that for all of my pairs, and then I will head back to my sewing machine to add the third piece for each row, and the fourth piece, so forth and so on, until I have pieced every part of that row. So you'll have these pairs. Like I said before, line them back up over on your design wall. Make sure you don't mix up your color orders. But then once you have sewn all of your pieces in a row, you will end up like this. So these are two rows that I finished, and pardon the color change, but working with a couple different samples at the same time to bounce back and forth for you. So I have two rows for my purple background, one done here, and next step is I'm going to take you to the sewing machine and show you how to sew those together. Now, if you did not trim the points off your diamonds initially, your rows are going to look a little different now, and that's okay. So instead of being like this, I'm going to slide those up, yours are going to look more like this. And you're going to have these points. You do not need to trim these points off before you begin to sew your rows together. It's an unnecessary step that will just take time. Those actually kind of serve to align with each other. So we're gonna hop back on over to the sewing machine, and I'm gonna show you with a set that the points have been trimmed off, so we have totally straight lines, and a set like this, how we sew them together over at the machine. Now that we have our rows complete, we're gonna work on sewing them together. And I suggest you do this in pairs. So I'm gonna take my first two rows, and when you align them up at your machine, you wanna make sure that you have a V. The opposite would be having a mountain heading towards your needle. This is for a couple reasons. First, it's so that you have your straight of grain on the bottom and your bias on top, so that you can manage your bias better. Second is because when we want to put these right sides together, while I'm sewing, I want to be able to peel it up and check, and it's much easier to do that when these seams come from the upper left to the bottom right. The other way would be from the upper right to bottom left. It's harder to peel it up and see accuracy. So line up your two pieced rows with a V towards your needle. This is another place where I don't pin. I find that there are subtle adjustments that need to be made from time to time, and I want to peel it up and check. And if it's pinned, I can't do that. So what I'll do is I'll line up the first seam right there, and I'll go start to sew my rows together. And then each time I peel it up and check, and I see, in that case, I'm right where I want to be. And so I can either use my finger, or this is a good opportunity if you have a stiletto to use that. And here's a great way to show you why I do this. So you'll see that my top piece is a little bit longer than my bottom piece. And if I just sew it as is, I'm not gonna have that seam line up. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna slightly shift my top piece up till I'm lined up properly. And it's gonna cause the top piece to bubble slightly. And that's okay, because what I'm gonna do is after I have it lined up, I'm gonna kind of use my finger as a pin and pull. It's gonna make that bubble go down, and I'm gonna ease those two pieces into each other. And again, check the next one. Continue that way down the length of this first pair of strips. Okay, so that first pair was the ones with the notches cut off. You may or may not have done that, so I'm going to show you a pair with the notches not, with the points not cut off so that you create the notches. I wouldn't bother spending the time to cut these off. I think it's a waste of time. They don't really get in the way. They'll just go underneath the guide. So same thing, we want to make sure we have that V. I'm going to flip these right sides together. And again, I'm not going to pin. I'm going to line up the first seam. And if you want to pin, go ahead. It's a very personal choice. Some people love pinning, some people don't. I'm the kind of person, I pin as little as possible. I only pin when I feel it's absolutely necessary. But if you have more success pinning, please go ahead and do that. Again, we're going to peel it up, double check. And you'll see the little dog ears just go underneath the guide foot. And when necessary, make those little adjustments, stretch. This is where I use the bias to my advantage rather than worrying about it. I use it to help me out if needed. So continue in this manner, sewing all of your pairs together, and I'll see you back over at the ironing board. After we sew 2 rows together, we need to press this seam. This is where the iron finger tool can come in handy. Not needed if you don't have one, but I'm going to show you how to use it. So we're going to take our piece right side down on your ironing mat and open the seam with your finger just to get it started. An important step here is we want to press, which is up and down, not iron. So, but you know, keeping that open with your finger is where things get scary. So this is where this comes in handy, because this can get ironed, doesn't burn. So I use this to keep the seam open as I walk my way down. Anywhere I would usually use my finger, I use my iron finger. And if I accidentally touch it, I'm not burning my finger, which would be unfortunate. So we're gonna go ahead, walk our way down the seam and press till we have that entire seam done. And I usually like to flip it over at this point and give it a little press on this side as well. You can do a little bit of wiggling, but you don't want to really iron because we are working with bias here and we don't want to stretch things unnecessarily. So sew all of your rows together into pairs and press all of your pairs, and then we can head back to the machine and finish sewing our table topper or our placemats together. Now that we have all of our rows sewn in pairs and pressed open, we're going to come back to the machine and begin to sew these pairs of rows together to finish the table runner or placemat, whichever one you're making. And again, we want to make sure that we have this V, so your actual rows will be pointing up, but what matters is we have that V in the middle again, and then we'll just Put them right sides together, sew 1/4 inch. Repeat to add all of our rows till our project is finished. Press our seams open, and then we're ready for the next step. Now that you have finished piecing your table runner or your placemat, you will notice that you'll have 2 straight sides and you'll have 2 sides that look like this. I suggest leaving them like this until you finish quilting your table topper. And if you've pressed all your seams open, as I suggested, this is what the back is going to look like. So you'll have this, then quilt it, and then after quilting, go ahead and trim it so that it is square, technically rectangle, but you know what I mean. So you have squared up edges, and go ahead and put your binding on. For this one, I chose just to do a simple walking foot straight line quilting in the background using matching thread. I used this homemade box from Arville. This perfectly matches the color in here. Super happy with how it turned out. So now I just gotta get to binding it. I hope you enjoyed piecing together your Seaside Table Runner or placemat. If you have any questions, feel free to ask those in the comments. The best place to get a quick answer is probably in our Journey to Nebula Facebook group. There's quite a lot of people in there, good community, and someone probably has the answer to your question quicker than I might be able to get to it. Look forward to seeing your Seaside Table Runners and placemats. Go ahead and post a picture on Instagram and use the hashtag Journey to Nebula to be entered in this week's giveaway. And I'd love to see them in the Facebook group as well.